Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. Welcome to Friday. Welcome to our session today called Collaboration and Complicity. Today, Kristen Thompson is going to be our teacher once again, and we're going to examine the range of choices that individuals and institutions made during the Holocaust, including specific examples of teachers with which Kristen was instrumental in the research around this module. We have a lot to cover today, like we have in the past, so I'm going to turn it over to Kristen right away.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. Hello, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us again today. As Laura mentioned, today we're going to be talking about collaboration and complicity in the Holocaust. So when we try to understand or answer the question regarding how and why did the Holocaust happen, obviously that's a very big question. We really have to think about this quote from Holocaust scholar Raoul Hilberg, and his quote says, "At crucial junctures, every individual makes a decision, and every decision is individual." So people did in fact make choices, and those choices that promoted both action and inaction allowed for the Holocaust to take place. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. Millions of ordinary people witnessed the crimes of the Holocaust in the countryside, in city squares, in stores and schools, in homes and workplaces. All across Europe, the Nazis found countless willing helpers who collaborated or were complicit in their crimes. Again, in trying to understand how and why did the Holocaust happen, we also need to look at what motives and pressures led to so many individuals being willing to abandon their fellow human beings, and why on the opposite end of that spectrum did others make the choice to help, often at great personal risk. When talking about the various decisions that people made or the actions that they took during the Holocaust, it seems like people are usually put into one of these categories or assigned one of these labels. So for the victim, obviously the person who is harmed or injured or killed as a result of a crime, accident, an event or an action. The rescuer, the person who saves someone from a dangerous or difficult situation. The bystander, the person who's present at an event or an incident, but they don't necessarily take part. The collaborator is the person who cooperates traitorously with an enemy. And then, of course, the perpetrators, the people who carry out the harmful, illegal, or immoral act. So I'm going to read some statements to you now. And for each one of these, I want you to think about, do you think this would be categorized as a victim, rescuer, bystander, collaborator, or perpetrator, one of those terms on the left? So to help us understand human behavior during the Holocaust, those who study or teach about it often identify individuals associated with it in one of these roles that we just mentioned. So the next few slides are going to give examples of some individual behaviors or choices that were made during the Holocaust. And again, after I read each one, I just want you to think about what role do you think that person would fall into. So here we have a Nazi government worker who acted as a spy prior to the war in order to help Germany achieve a quick, successful military invasion of Poland in 1939. Then we have a friend and close associate of SS officers who never personally committed violence, but was often present when violence against Jewish individuals took place, including murder. And again, which role do you think that person was playing then? Here we have a German industrialist who used free labor of Jewish prisoners provided by a concentration camp in order to make a fortune during the war. This next individual is a German citizen who added an armaments manufacturing division to his factory in order to claim that Jewish workers were essential to the war effort, thereby keeping them from being deported. Then we have a young opportunist who joined the Nazi Party because he recognized the only chance to make money in the Reich was through party allegiance. Next one is a man who actively protected Jewish people from the Gestapo when roundups and deportations began from the ghetto. And a capitalist who seized Jewish property and assets that became available when Jews were stripped of their legal rights under Nazi laws. This one's a member of the Nazi Party fleeing Germany at the end of the war to avoid being arrested as a suspected war criminal. Or a local builder who planned and constructed a concentration camp in coordination with local SS and Nazi officials. And the last one, this one's a German Catholic citizen who's honored at Yad Vashem as a righteous among nations for rescuing more than 1,000 Jews from deportation at Auschwitz. Well, would it surprise you to know that every one of those statements refers to just one person, and that one person is Oskar Schindler. It's important for us to recognize the fluid nature of human beings and motives and pressures that affect our choices. Human nature isn't always black and white. There's usually a lot of gray area, and it's fluid. Our choices and decisions can change based on the circumstances we find ourselves in, if those circumstances change, the timing, geography. So when we think specifically about the Holocaust and World War II, it mattered where people were located geographically and what was happening within the cover of war. Those kinds of things impacted the decisions and choices that people made. So because of this, we need to be careful about ascribing these labels that we were just talking about to individuals. The labels are more useful if we describe an individual action or decision or behavior, meaning just that one action, decision, behavior. But the labels aren't really so helpful when we're trying to describe the individual as a person or as a whole, because as we said, human nature shifts and changes, circumstances change. And so just like Oskar Schindler, he's ending up at the end, being honored in Yad Vashem, but look at some of the other things that he had done as well, where he was a war profiteer, he was a spy for a while. So again, it's not black and white, it's very much a gray area when we're talking about human nature. So as we look at some of the choices that we're going to be doing here soon, that individuals made during the Holocaust, we start to see how the Holocaust was possible. The Nazi leaders needed and found a broad range of helpers that helped ranged from active participation to passive complicity. The museum had an exhibit that was out before the Americans and the Holocaust, which is the new exhibit. Right now, they've changed out that space. And so unfortunately, this one is only available online anymore, but it's the name of the exhibit is Somewhere Neighbors, Collaboration and Complicity in the Holocaust. And it does a wonderful job of really trying to expand the lens through which we see the Holocaust and trying to see ordinary people doing seemingly ordinary things, kind of like you see in this photograph here. Typically, we focus on what's at the center of the Holocaust, those key events, the victims, the perpetrators, bystanders, rescuers. But by expanding that lens, we still keep those elements at the center, but we start to include people, events, actions, and behaviors that are more out on the periphery. Like you see in these photos, people who are maybe simply doing their job. So many of these people are government workers, bureaucratic paper kinds of people, but now all of a sudden, simply doing their job is actually part of that systematic state-sponsored bureaucracy that we talked about in the definition of the Holocaust, that's not only allowing the Holocaust to happen, but in some cases actually aiding the Nazis in the perpetration of the Holocaust. So this center picture, for example, is a person who is keeping track of records. And so they're actually allowing the Nazis to know where the Jewish people live by going and sifting through his cards and getting identification papers on people. So again, this idea of just simply doing one's job actually enabled the Nazis to fulfill their job. So by expanding this lens, we start to recognize the entire range of behaviors and actions and how they contributed to the Holocaust. It also challenges and complicates our thinking about what actions were and are possible for individuals when we're confronted with hatred and genocide. It helps us identify the full spectrum of pressures and motives that people may have felt, which may have caused them to take action or may have caused them not to take action. Motives and pressures such as, like we said, just doing my job, perhaps fear, maybe personal gain. On this picture down on the lower right, you can see sort of a wagon wheel and a horse. That's an auction that is taking place. So the Jewish people from this community have already been removed, and now the items from their households are being auctioned away. So it was people within their community who showed up to participate in this, and these were their neighbors. Well, if you're auctioning away their items, clearly they're not coming back. So even if you don't know at this point where they're taking the Jewish people and what that final end of the story is going to be, you know that they're not coming back. And yet you're contributing to this by buying the items, by helping with the auction, et cetera. So maybe it's for personal gain that you've gone along with some of these things. Maybe it's social pressure, like the picture in the top left-hand corner, where there's a public humiliation taking place with the young girl and the sign around her neck. Maybe it's part of that mob mentality and social peer pressures. Maybe it's a sense of power that you now have over your neighbors that you didn't have before. So again, all of these motives and pressures that people were experiencing. And to try and think about those motives and pressures, we're not trying to justify or make excuses for the decisions that people made, but rather it's to try and better understand the complexities of the situation. Again, because we're talking about human nature, and it's not white, it's gray, and it's complex. So with that, we're going to watch the introductory film for the exhibition, Some More Neighbors, Collaboration and Complicity. It's about 5 minutes long, and then we'll jump back into the rest of our lesson.
Some were neighbors.
And among them was some of the people he went to school with, some of his best friends, the guys from the card club.
And out of that crowd came a friend of my father.
We were friends, I thought.
This was a boy that grew up with me for 16 years, and he could do something like this.
And that was my best friend.
They were neighbors.
The furniture and the glass was all in shatters. Everything was, my father's butcher store, the window was broken in and everything was demolished. And this was done by young people whom we knew.
After the Holocaust, many survivors recognized the roles of Adolf Hitler and other true believers. Ideological hardliners who supported the Nazi Party early on and who viewed Jews as biologically inferior. But how could so many ordinary fellow human beings, even people they knew, have betrayed them, taken pleasure in their persecution, benefited in some way from their misfortune? Before the Holocaust, Jewish life in Europe was diverse. In some places, especially in Central and Western Europe, many Jews were integrated into the larger society through school, the workplace, and other settings. In Eastern Europe, many of the millions of Jews who lived there resided in predominantly Jewish communities, meeting non-Jews through business and the marketplace. After the Nazis took power in Germany, the new regime's goal was to deprive Jews of their rights and livelihoods and force them to leave the Reich. During World War II, Germany conquered and directly ruled vast areas of Eastern Europe. The marking and isolation of Jews from non-Jews were first steps toward their destruction. German-ruled Eastern Europe became the main terrain for the mass murder of Jews by Germans and their collaborators, including many Jews who lived far away in countries allied with or occupied by Germany, whom collaborating police often assembled for transport to the east.
One of the nastiest memories I have is getting going on that journey, and people were lined up the stairs, up to the door of the apartment, waiting to ransack whatever we left behind, cursing at us, yelling at us, spitting at us as we left.
The Holocaust would not have happened without centuries of the longest hatred, prejudices, discrimination, and attacks on Jews and Jewish property. Jews were a religious minority in largely Christian Europe. Other pressures and motives, ones that affect individuals in less extreme circumstances, also came to the fore. Fears and pressures in school, work, and the community, roles as students, teachers, workers, police, soldiers, neighbors, friends, influenced their choices to go along with their peers or to defer to authority, even when they had some moral qualms.
This is the real truth. That was my girlfriend. We used to go to her together, have fun together, left together before the last test, before the graduation. We were studying together for nights and nights, and she did it to me, to us, to my family.
Many individuals also succumbed to pressures, risks, and age-old temptations. While it might be comforting to think that people were simply forced to do what they did, or that they were even brainwashed, examples of individuals who did help those in danger prove that people did have choices, even in the face of great risks and temptations.
So Leo had a great deal of our possession at that point. And we went to Leo for food. Now, I must impress upon you as to the character of Leo. Leo already had all the stuff that he could ever get from us, except maybe for some land. And all he had to do is tell us to get lost, and he would have never seen us again. He never did. He fed us all along.
So keeping in mind the Somewhere Neighbors lens, that people did make choices for a whole host of reasons, we're going to focus in on some specific professions now, mainly the education profession. Holocaust Education Today offers trainings for those in the military, including the National Guard, law enforcement, and at the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC, that includes training every year for Secret Service agents, FBI agents, and a lot of different organizations offer training for their local police departments, the judiciary, education, and the medical field. These same institutions that were to uphold democracy and were entrusted to protect their citizens, they failed during the Holocaust. And so one of the important things to examine is how can we safeguard ourselves today from making those same mistakes that they made back in history? So we're going to take a closer look at the role of teachers during the Holocaust. And as Laura said, this was actually my research project that I worked on when I was on staff at the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC. And I was a classroom teacher for 18 years before that. So this was very near and dear to my heart, and trying to understand how teachers had an opportunity to even make choices during the Holocaust and what kinds of motives and pressures drove them to make those decisions. So under the authority of the Third Reich, teachers were obligated to join what was called the National Socialist Teachers League, the NSLB. That was their teacher union. And they also had to take an oath of loyalty to the Fuhrer. So today, even teachers have to sign, in a lot of states, an oath, and they have to sign that over. But typically, it's an oath talking about the Constitution, or it's for their state. This is an oath of loyalty that they are taking to one man, to an individual, to Hitler himself. And that oath that the teachers took would be something very similar to this picture that you see here of the judges and clerks of the Berlin courts, where they're swearing allegiance to Hitler at a special ceremony that marks their loyalty to the Nazi principles. Within this framework, though, teachers were still able to make individual choices. Some teachers chose to comply with Nazi ideology, while others chose to act in opposition. hence the title of my research project, Oath and Opposition, Education Under the Third Reich. So in this particular photo, you see three teachers who are being publicly humiliated. The person on the left is a professor, and he's wearing a sign that reads, "I criticized an SA leader." The gentleman in the middle is a teacher, and his sign says, "I forbid my students from saying Heil Hitler." And the third gentleman, also a teacher, we can't read his sign just because of the way he's positioned in the photo. But this was in 1933. So Nazi ideology was to become the norm in the education curriculum. However, they didn't have a centralized authority that was enforcing any sort of a direct or uniform mandate as to what this was going to look like in the classroom. So that is what allowed for this room for some personal choice. There were three entities that were sort of vying for control of how that curriculum was supposed to look in the classroom. And one of those was the Ministry of Education. Typically, their role is to provide administrative oversight, much like Department of Education today. And this particular photo is the Reichsminister Bernhard Rust. The next entity trying to vie for control of what this new Nazi curriculum is going to look like is the teacher union, the NSLB. They were promoting something that would look probably similar to character education today. The school teachers would receive instruction in racial theory at special teacher union schools. There was one particularly in Hohenfeld, Germany. And really its main task was to indoctrinate the teachers into a Nazi worldview so that then they would, in turn, return back to their classrooms and indoctrinate their students. And the third entity vying for this control of what this was going to look like to implement Nazi ideology in the classroom was the Hitler Youth. They believed that youth learned best from other youth, and you should learn by doing, such as attending their youth camps, their weekend outings. This might be similar to outcome-based education that we used to have. Even though the youth believed they learned best from other youth, there were adults behind the scenes sort of pulling the strings when it came to the Hitler Youth. The meetings were led by young youth leaders themselves, but they would be sent mailings every month from adults telling them, these are the songs we want you to practice this month at your outings. These are the themes we want you to, instruct people in. So there were definitely adults who were at the core of that, but they just sort of made it look like the youth were actually the ones running the program as well. So this photo is members of Hitler Youth. They're singing as they march at a youth camp. The flag in the foreground bears the single lightning bolt, which was the symbol of the Hitler Youth, and that was in 1934. So we have a short introductory film that introduces the Oath and Opposition module that we're going to then go into some case studies and talk about some individuals and the choices that they made. So while we're watching this intro film, I want you to sort of look for those three entities we were just talking about, the Ministry of Education, the Teachers Union, and the Hitler Youth, who are all vying for this control of what the school curriculum is now going to look like. And I tested everything before you all joined us. I don't understand why it's not working. Well, we'll try it on here instead.
After Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, the Nazis moved quickly to control education and the schools. They recognized that a new generation of supporters would be critical to their success. Responsibility for carrying out the educational goals of the Nazi Party fell to the National Socialist Teachers League, the NSLB, the Ministry of Education, and the Hitler Youth. The NSLB was responsible for indoctrinating educators in the fundamentals of Nazi ideology. Teachers were required to attend training camps, and good teachers could be rewarded for their loyalty and dedication. Those who refused risked public humiliation or dismissal. Jewish teachers in Germany had no such choice, as they were forced from their jobs in public schools regardless of their abilities and teaching accomplishments. This was followed several years later by the expulsion of Jewish students from German public schools. The Ministry of Education developed new courses based on what the Third Reich believed students should learn, especially race science. Simply put, race science was the belief that individuals were organized into races, some inherently superior to others, and that Germans were members of a superior race destined to rule all of Europe. The Nazis viewed Jews as an inferior race that fed off the superior races like parasites and needed to be eliminated as parasites. In spite of the mandate from the Ministry of Education, teachers could use their own initiative to instruct their students in this new science. Methods ranged from subjecting students to measurements of their heads while their classmates watched, to encouraging their students to harass and bully Jews, whether in their schools or indeed in their communities. Textbooks were revised to reflect Nazi ideology, from studies on racial science to propaganda targeted at young children. The Nazis also relied on the Hitler Youth to indoctrinate a new generation. "I begin with the young," said Adolf Hitler. "With them, I can make a new world." Although the Hitler Youth resembled youth clubs that promoted camaraderie and outdoor activities, the reality was more sinister. Marching, war games, and pro-Nazi speech and song made up a larger part of Hitler Youth activities than did camping or hiking. The primary purpose of the Hitler Youth was to win over hearts and minds, mold young people into passionate believers in the Nazi cause. Action over study, unquestioning obedience over independent thought, and loyalty to Adolf Hitler above all else. With this shift in Germany's educational aims, it could be suggested that educators, students, and parents had no choice but to conform to the new order. But teachers in the Third Reich did make choices, whether because or in spite of the pressures they were now facing. At war's end in 1945, with the Third Reich overthrown and Germany under Allied occupation, the country's educational system was in shambles. Denazifying Germany's schools took years to accomplish. And as with other citizens of post-war Germany, those who had been teachers and students during the 12 years of Nazi rule struggled with the burden of each choice they had made, even when that choice was to do nothing at all.
So now we're going to examine some case studies to explore the choices that teachers made during the Holocaust. This first case study is about a young teacher named Jean de Man. And normally if we were in person, there would be a reading that we would do together that you'd actually be handed. And so instead, to try and make things a little bit simplified for this virtual learning that we're all doing now instead, I've put it together as a narration with some of the photos. So instead, you'll just sit back and listen to the case study, and then we'll come back and sort of debrief it right after that. Why are we having technical difficulties today? There we go.
Jean de Man was a school teacher who saved 2,000 Jewish school children and worked for the Belgian resistance. For her efforts, she was recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. This is her story. Jean de Man was born into a Belgian Catholic family in 1919. When World War II began, she was a young Roman Catholic school teacher in Belgium. The Nazis, after annexing Austria, claiming part of Czechoslovakia, conquering Poland, and occupying Denmark and Norway, conquered Belgium and the Netherlands in May of 1940. They then organized the classroom curriculum to fit their propaganda requirements. De Man said, "Under their curriculum, I couldn't teach what I wanted to. I wouldn't teach what they wanted me to. My parents agreed. I took employment as a secretary. I spoke German. I was Catholic. The Nazis paid no attention. I was safe." De Man quietly resigned from public school teaching. After Jewish children were no longer permitted to attend regular public schools, Vela Perelman approached De Man and asked whether she would be willing to join the staff of No Petit, a Jewish kindergarten in Brussels. The Perelmans were prominent Jewish citizens of Warsaw, Poland, who emigrated to Brussels and became Belgian citizens before Germany invaded. De Man was only 21 years old at the time. She said, "I had no contact with Judaism or the Jewish world, but the need was demonstrated clearly when we heard that due to a Nazi raid, a small child left alone at home fell through a window to the street below and was killed. Having been raised in an anti-Nazi atmosphere, my immediate impulse was to agree to go into this work. It was essentially a question for me to take a political position, one of solidarity with the victims of the Nazis and sympathy for the children involved." De Man became the headmistress of No Petit at age 23. Jewish schools had a precarious existence. It was a great danger to keep the children together because Nazi raids on Jews had already begun. The tactics of the No Petit staff changed as the occupation went on, and clandestine efforts to find shelter and hiding places for the children to save their lives became a matter of first importance. Initially, children were placed with non-Jewish Belgian families simply out of a spirit of solidarity toward children in danger. However, as time passed, it became necessary to find money to make monthly payments to families providing shelter for the children. Children were given new names and identities. These details would be rehearsed repeatedly with the child, with the teacher stressing the importance of never making a mistake. There were times, however, when the placements did not work out well, and De Man was forced to move the child again. Eventually, Jewish schools, including No Petit, were closed. Vela Perelman once again asked De Man to continue her rescue efforts by joining the underground. A network emerged, placing Jewish women as maids in the homes of the Belgian elite. De Man was involved in obtaining false identity papers and ration cards for them. She also worked with the underground to search for people who were denouncing Jews to the Gestapo. Near the end of the war, De Man became actively involved with the Belgian resistance, transporting arms on her bicycle and providing intelligence. De Man continued her efforts after the war by reuniting Jewish orphans with their families and fundraising for Israel through the United Jewish Appeal. Jean de Man was honored in 1971 by the Belgian Jewish Committee, the King of Belgium, and Yad Vashem as a righteous among nations. This excerpt from De Man's diary highlights the motives and pressures she faced, which influenced the decisions she made. She says, "It was at the height of the raids. We knew, of course, when children didn't come to roll call, that meant their families, including them, had been taken by the Nazis. It became the way of life for us, day after day. But one day, Gestapo agents arrived at the school in a truck. They named 3 children, told me they had been asked by their mothers to pick them up and take the little ones to them. These Gestapo men were pleasant and polite. Of course, I knew what it meant, but I had to think of the 60 other children we had in our school that day. I was helpless to stand up to them, and I didn't. I dressed those children myself. The youngest was 3.5 years old. I put them in the truck myself, delaying the moment when the Nazis would touch them. And then they took them away. We learned later that the parents were hiding, and the Nazis used this trick to get them out into the open. It worked. They got them all. I knew those children would never be seen again, or their families. I couldn't intervene without peril to all of our children, but I felt I should have done something. I was anti-Nazi by conviction before. Now I wanted to strike back myself to damage them. When Mrs. Perelman asked me, I didn't need time to answer. From the time I stood and watched those 3 children taken away from me, I was ready to join the underground."
So John de Man's efforts took many forms, from small acts, reaching out to parents, to grand gestures, working as a spy, transporting weapons for the resistance. There's one story that we even had to cut just for time's sake as it was getting too long, But she's an amazing woman, and I hope someday somebody makes an entire film about her or writes a big book about her. She also, when she was working with the Underground for Phelan Perlman, she would get invited to a lot of these fancy balls and different kinds of events that the Nazis were holding. And so she would go and she would sort of flirt with one of the officers, and they would set up a meeting or another date for later in the week. And she'd meet them someplace, and eventually they would end up wandering out to this area that backed up to a forest, and other members of the Underground would be there waiting for them, and that officer, that Nazi officer, would never be seen again. So she had all kinds of talents that she was great at and very dangerous work that she was doing, but she was very committed to it. So it's important to remember, however, though, we tend to put these rescuers up on a pedestal. And again, there's a lot of gray area. It's not just black and white. Even some of these homes where they were taking the children in, eventually they had to pay them in order to keep doing this because it was a risk. So the fact that those people now required money in order to still hide and save the children, does that change our opinions about them as a rescuer? Jeanne de Man still talks about how those 3 children that she had to put on that truck that day haunted her. And that's really what drove her to join the resistance. But she did hand over those 3 children. So again, that sort of complicates our thinking about these rescuers. And again, they're people, they're individuals. And so their human nature is going to be fluid, and they make different choices in different moments because of the circumstances that they're presented with. But it's important to remember that this one small act eventually leads to another and another, and there's sort of a ripple effect that culminates in the rescue of thousands. But it starts with one small act, taking one small step to do the right thing, and one decision to not just stand idly by. Her diary excerpts, like we said, tell us how she was haunted by those 3 children, but she doesn't let that stop her and somehow make her freeze. Instead, she's going to turn that anger and that desperation that she felt after that into doing something positive for the other children that she could save. And she's a teacher. She's not a high-ranking official, but she used the resources that were available to her. She had a network of helpers. She also didn't do this completely alone. She paid attention to what was going on around her, and she acted on the analysis of those events. So the pictures that you saw in there, that was actually her diary. The museum has it now. And that was her attendance book that she kept of the children. And as they stopped showing up for classes, she would start putting dashes on those dates. So again, she's paying attention to all of those details, and she's trying to act on that information to save as many as she can. She noticed when the kids didn't show up at school, she listens to the parents as they have pleas for help, and she responded positively when the call to action came from Phelan Perlman. So the important thing again to remember is that all of us can choose to make a difference, even if it's just one small step that we take. We may not realize the implications that that's going to have down the road. It could actually lead to something much greater than we could ever imagine. So now we're going to take a look at, sadly, the opposite extreme of this. This particular case study is about a group of teachers who worked at a deaf school, and they chose to have their students sterilized by great numbers. So we're going to listen to this one, and then again, we'll come back and sort of debrief after it. And I do have to warn you, this one can be difficult to listen to, so I apologize up front about that. Part of the story obviously is very disturbing, but that's the truth and the reality of the Holocaust in so many ways and on so many levels. Oh, I was hoping we were done with technical difficulties.
Why did some teachers choose to protect their students while others chose to collaborate with the Nazis? This is the story of teachers who facilitated the sterilization of their students. At the Training Institute for Teachers of the Deaf in Berlin, Gotthold Lehmann became the school principal and director of the teacher training program in 1924. He encouraged the implementation of the sterilization law among the students in his institution. Sources say he took the initiative to inform authorities about his deaf students and had children as young as 10 years old sterilized against their parents' wishes. Lehman hired teachers who were loyal to the Nazi cause and quickly wrote to the Reich officials so they would be recognized for their so-called professionalism. One of his hires, a teacher by the name of Schurman, had recommended that his student, a 14-year-old boy, be sterilized. The student had tried to escape from the school 3 times. On his 3rd attempt, Sherman had police apprehend him, put him in handcuffs, beat him, and deliver him to the hospital for sterilization. Sherman was recognized as a leader at the school and given a promotion. In another example, Gotthold Lehman wrote a letter to a parent explaining the sterilization that had taken place. Dear Frau N., the names were kept off of the records. Your child was released from the clinic in good health on August 16. The operation proceeded normally. Your child has already written you about this. The law stipulates that in the case of persons above 14 years of age, the operation may be performed without the consent of parents and guardians. You could not then have changed anything in this regard. I believe that it will be quite a good thing for your child that she has no children. Her life will likely be hard enough as it is. With best regards, Heil Hitler, Gotthold Lehman. At the Provincial Institute for the Deaf in Soest, Director Veggie carried out his educational duties in an SS uniform. He reported to the Reich on every student with handwritten notes in the margins. It is believed he recommended 98% of his students for sterilization. He also recommended that this be done during the summer holiday to prevent student unrest and to avoid circulation of details of the sterilization among clubs of the deaf. Health authorities agreed with this recommendation. Documents demonstrate that many were forcibly sterilized, and that Veggie not only notified authorities, but arranged the transport of his students to the clinics where the operations were performed. Parents often were not informed until after the operation had taken place. Teachers, local police, and city government officials collaborated with the Nazis to carry out the orders. This is an example of a decision regarding sterilization provided by the District Police Authority and signed by a doctor. The decision, it is hereby ordered that N, again names kept off documents, be forcibly conveyed to the hospital in Günzburg for sterilization operation unless she immediately goes there of her own accord. N is to be sterilized in accordance with the decision of the Hereditary Health Court of the Augsburg District Court of October 20, 1936. The decision has been drawn up by the court clerk in the offices of the Hereditary Health Court, with the mention that it becomes final on November 13, 1936, and that the sterilization operation may also be performed against the will of the subject. This decision was delivered on November 19, 1936, to the legal representative of N. The father is a farmer, and again the town is also left off, with the order of the public health officer that N present herself for the operation at either the municipal hospital in Augsburg or in Günzburg within 2 weeks. Since N did not submit to sterilization voluntarily, nor did her legal representative provide any further explanation, forcible sterilization at the hospital of Günzburg is to be effected in accordance with the prescription of the State Health Authority in Dillingen, with the assistance of the responsible police authorities, mayor of the city of Dillingen. Helga Gross was a deaf child who was sterilized at the age of 16. One of her brothers was also deaf, but he avoided sterilization due to hospital overcrowding. She refused to join the Nazi Party. Helga successfully immigrated to the United States in 1954 with her deaf husband, though they were initially denied entry due to their so-called handicap.
Because
they explained to the deaf children that they did not want deaf children, that they had to be sterilized because they didn't want deaf children to have children who would grow up and be deaf as well. We were young, we really didn't understand.
The man that came from government.
The man that came from the government to our school told the teacher to choose which children that we should send to the hospital for sterilization. Then as the time became near, I was in the kitchen and I was cleaning. My mother came and said, "Helga, sit down." And she explained, "You have to go to the hospital in 2 days."
My father cried.
My father cried. He refused to see me. He didn't want to hug me before I left home to go to the hospital. Not until later, years later, I saw my baby sister. She had a beautiful baby. The baby was so beautiful, and I got to hold the baby. And that morning, my sister was feeding the baby, and then I realized what I felt when I realized I couldn't have any children. I started to cry, and I ran into the bathroom and just cried and cried. When I came back out, my sister said, "What's wrong? What's the matter?" I said, "Oh, I'm just crying because I'm happy for you because you have a beautiful child."
That's obviously heartbreaking. And she actually was deaf because of a high fever that she had. It wasn't something that was hereditary and could have been passed down, but regardless, I heard a lot of the teachers simply admitted high percentages of their students for the sterilization, and some teachers were getting promotions out of this. They were getting a raise out of it. And so again, thinking about those motives and pressures that people felt, and yes, it's after the Great Depression and people were hard up for money, but at what point do individuals draw that line where you say, I absolutely can't do that? That's selling your soul and helping, be a collaborator, et cetera. So again, just trying to think about the different kinds of pressures and motives that people were feeling that drove the decisions that they made, because people did have choices. Even if you were supposed to turn over some of your students' realization, did they have to turn over 98%? What were some other choices that teachers could have made in that circumstance? The last case study that we're going to talk about has to do with the teachers in Norway. And just to give a really brief timeline of events that took place in Norway, Germany had invaded Norway in 1940, hoping to secure some naval bases. And on June 10th of that year, the King of Norway, King Haakon VII, along with their Norwegian government, they managed to get out. And so they escaped to London, and they set up a government in exile in London, and were still ruling from there. In their absence, however, a man by the name of Quisling, who's a fascist, proclaimed himself to be the new prime minister of Norway. German forces in Norway finally surrendered in 1945 in May. And in that October, then Quisling was executed after he was found guilty for being a traitor. So the story of the teachers in Norway is really quite something. Members of teacher unions in Norway distributed some leaflets urging them to stay fast and remain loyal to their country and true to their profession by refusing to sign any pledge promoting Nazism. And again, the Nazis really wanted to get involved in the schools in Norway because they felt that the way to the future was to indoctrinate the youth, because as soon as the youth believe in your cause, then your future, is laid out in front of you, where you have all of these followers who are going to be loyal. So they really wanted to change the curriculum in Norway as well, and have the curriculum in the schools just like they did in Germany. So in February 1942, Quisling, this person who has proclaimed himself the new prime minister since the king is ruling from London now, he demanded that there be mandatory membership in Norway's National Teacher Union for German occupation. So it was basically the same as in Germany now. It was going to be a Nazi type of teacher union. In response, the Norwegian Department of Education was flooded with letters of protest, including letters from parents. Within 2 months, 90% of Norway's 14,000 teachers resigned from the union, making his demand for this mandatory membership ineffectual. In March of that year, 1 in every 10 teachers was arrested, and they were pressured to retract their protests. They were supposed to sign a letter of apology, and then after they've signed the letter, they were to then still join the union. Those arrested were sent to concentration camps and put to hard labor. Between March and April of 42, 10,000 teachers had their salaries withheld. Again, trying to pressure them that if you join this union, you will then get your salary reinstated. The Norwegian government in exile in London sent money to help the families of the incarcerated teachers so that they wouldn't feel the need to sign and agree with the Nazis. The civilian resistance was also collecting donations from private citizens, kind of going door to door. And then this money would be collected and once again given to the families of the teachers who were arrested. There were smuggled reports regarding the appalling conditions and the unspeakable treatment to which the teachers were subjected, and those reports were making their way to Oslo. Despite the Nazi-imposed ban on demonstrations, the citizens who were enraged staged protests throughout the country, and this led to strengthening the morale and renewing the spirit of the Norwegians. The teachers' resistance seemed to inspire other people in Norway to join the civilian resistance movement as well. They claimed that it was remarkable that teachers could inflict such an unconditional ideological defeat upon Nazism in Norway. There can be no doubt that the Nazi attempts at mobilizing Norwegian children for purposes of Nazification, more than anything else, solidified the home front. They weren't going to have that in Norway. You're not going to do that to our kids. So after 2.5 months of humiliation, forced resignations, loss of pay, torture, and other forms of maltreatment, it was obvious to the authorities that nothing was going to break the solidarity of these teachers. On April 25th of 1942, there was a decree ordering the dismissal of teachers refusing to join the union, and that was repealed at that point. So by May, the schools start to reopen, and teachers were gradually released from prison. Although they no longer were required to belong to the union, they were still expected to teach Nazi ideology and curriculum, and therefore many of the teachers refused to return to work. There were 700 teachers arrested from Eastern Norway who were transported to a military training ground near Lillehammer after a grueling 14-hour train ride in open coal cars without food. The teachers were ordered out in the middle of the night, 10 miles from their destination, and they were made to march the rest of the way. Those who collapsed were whipped or kicked in order to proceed. After reaching the training ground, they were given a slice of bread for breakfast and then put through a series of exhausting physical exercises, drills, and marches. Those who lagged behind or hesitated were made to crawl on their stomachs through ice, water, snow, and slush with hands tied behind their backs. Again, this is springtime in Norway. You can imagine what the weather conditions were like. Some were given the task of carrying snow on a table fork or a broom handle, or moving wood piles back and forth. All of this was done to break the spirit of the group. Even after being subjected to such harsh conditions, the majority remained firm. Those who gave typically had family responsibilities, such as young children or maybe a spouse who was ill, and they simply had to get home. The prisoners were all paraded outside the barracks occupied by the Nazis in charge of the camp. The first man to be in to sign the statement of apology was a sickly, rather elderly teacher who had sole responsibility for a flock of children. The others let him know that there would be no reproaches if he signed. They understood. He dragged himself up the steps in an obvious state of collapse, which was painful to watch. 2 or 3 minutes passed, and then he came out to the platform at the top of the steps, a completely new man. Standing in front of all 600 men, he clenched his fists and shouted, "I bloody well didn't sign." Then he went back to his place, and after that, it was not easy for anyone else to give way. But if he was going to hold strong and not sign that paper, how could anybody else justify it? On this last part, since we're getting low on time here, we're going to listen to a few of the survivors recalling their experiences at school. Some of them highlight the atmosphere that the teachers set in the classroom, while others talk about their classmates and how they were treated by them. So we're going to look at just a couple of them. Sorry.
But on the day in 33, in April, we had a wonderful old teacher, a small old woman called Dr. Conrad. And she was a humanist, there was no doubt about it. The whole school was humanist. Our director was a great humanist. And she came into the class with a big book under her arm, and she addressed us. She spoke a slightly old-fashioned German. She would say, "Mein Kinder," my children, "Mein Kinder." Today, we are changing our lecture, and from now on, we are going to read Mein Kampf, written by our Führer, Adolf Hitler. And we have to interrupt our romantic literature like Eichendorff, and you can't read anymore Goethe or Schiller. You have to read. And she was upset. She was very upset. And I think she had tears in her eyes. At the time, I wasn't quite sure whether she was joyful about Hitler or tearful about that we have to change our literature. But I go for the second one, and I know that for sure.
Teacher, she was the only one that was a party member at that time, and she recruited all the kids as she could to the Hitler Youth, and she was also working with the Gestapo, the secret police, and so she spied on parents, on kids, on other teachers, and so everybody was really afraid of her.
So two very different extremes with the teachers, one who's really upset about having to change curriculum, and the other teacher who actually, shows up in uniform and is turning students into the Gestapo. We'll just listen to a couple others actually. We're gonna go ahead and skip to the end here. There's one woman who does a very good job of just summing everything up for us. So this is Esther Bem.
And I also want to say that I have, as I was passionately going after this business of living, I feel today such a gratitude to those people that saved us. And these were ordinary people that will never be in history books, that I unfortunately don't even remember their names, and probably they're not alive anymore. And I probably wouldn't have even the emotional strength to find them. But I want to say, in the era when goodness was very rare, they cultivated it. And they showed that human decency and heroism, which was so rare in those times, they did it for us. And I am aware today that to be heroic is so unpredictable. They probably wouldn't have known by themselves that they are going to behave the way that they did. They simply reacted to our despair with compassion. They didn't think of themselves. They didn't care what happens to them. And when you think, we were not family, we were not even friends, we were strangers that fell from somewhere into their laps, and they never looked for excuses to say, well, we can't, I'm sorry, we have a young family. Never. And they never made us feel even that we are intruding on them. And this is something that I want the post-Holocaust generation to know, that people have choices, and they have proven it.
It's a little bit hard to understand that last sentence that she says, but it's on the screen here. So something I want the post-Holocaust generation to know: people had choices, and they have proven it. The people who saved her clearly choices were made, and those people by their actions proved that others could have made different choices than they did as well. So again, just reflecting back on the quote that we started with, at crucial junctures, every individual makes a decision and every decision is individual. And hopefully that's the guiding principle that we remember as well, that hopefully we're making decisions that are not only in our best interest, but are in the best interest of humanity and those around us, and thinking about our neighbors and our friends and how our decisions impact others as well. And with that, we're right at 2 o'clock.
We are, Kristen. Thank you. Thank you. I've seen you present about the educators before, and a couple of these stories bring tears to my eyes every time. Jean DeMond is for sure a hero. Very, very powerful research. So thank you for sharing it with us today. It is 2 o'clock. I just want to mention a couple of things. On Monday, next week, we actually have 3 guest lecturers who are curators, experts in the field. Monday, we have Sarah Risa, who's from USHMM, who's going to talk about the role of law enforcement in conformity. Wednesday, we have Dr. Eva Schaller, who is going to speak to us about Holocaust by bullets in the Einsatzgruppen. And on Friday, we have Dr. Becky Erbelding, who is going to talk to us about Americans in the Holocaust, which is a traveling exhibition that will be coming to the Midwest next year. So please join us if you can, and thank you once again for joining us today.